Well, hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV after what seems an eternity of me not being here. If you haven't been following and keeping up with the news, I've been away for 2 weeks, Croatia and Bosnia, and then just come back from the insanely fantastic We Have Ways festival over in the UK, where every World War II historian who was of any note was pretty much there giving a presentation to fellow World War II buffs, and it's just absolutely incredibly fantastic. And the We Have Ways podcast I look to as kind of an elder brother or a father figure in my limited YouTube capacity. It's great to be back. A reminder, if you're new, if you've perhaps found us from a link because We Have Ways, this is your first show, please subscribe to World War II TV. Use the description in the YouTube panel below there to get links to my guests' work, my guests' books. The book links are down there, merchandise, social media links, and share the word with other people, and maybe consider becoming a patron as well. So our subjects this week, apart from when we have Dilip Sarkar on later in the week, and we have Glenn Harper on tomorrow talking about the New Zealanders in Crete, it's really all about the last week or the last couple of weeks of July in 1944 in Normandy. That's the link between the programs. We have some shows about Operation Goodwood, Operation Spring. We'll be discussing General Bradley, and Kevin Hemel, friend of the show, is coming on later in the week to talk about the 8th Corps' fantastic sweep down the Cotentin towards Avranches. But I'm in Normandy, as you know, and the Normandy Cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach. Every Normandy guide who comes here, every tour group who comes through, one of the things they know is that the most senior American general American buried in that cemetery is General Lesley McNair. Most of them would then know he died in the early stages of Cobra, and then some of them would know he was a staff officer, and a few would know details of his career before then. I'm definitely in that kind of latter category. I didn't know very much about General McNair until I acquired a copy of today's guest's book, General Lesley McNair, by Mark Calhoun. He's going to come on now and talk about this incredibly interesting figure. And you will find, folks, that this is a person that had way more influence in the development of way more things you could possibly imagine of the US Army. Its doctrine, its approach to warfare, its modernization. And I'm going to be delighted to bring my guest on, Mark Calhoun. So he's waiting for me offside there. So there we are. Good afternoon, Mark. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
So you are retired lieutenant colonel. You have been teaching military history, notably in Kansas. Run us through a little bit of your career and then how that kind of brought you to writing about McNair, because there are lots of I'm going to use the inappropriate word, sexy figures in military history who are instant kind of cash cows. You just got to think of Churchill and Patton and people like that. And McNair, a lot of people would kind of go, McNair. So
Absolutely.
Career first, and then how did you find McNair?
Sure. So I was a 20-year Army officer and aviator. I flew the Chinook helicopter. While I was in the Army, I had the opportunity to go to the Command and General Staff College. And while I was there, I did an MAS, a master's degree in history. And I encountered McNair in that. I used a case study of Kasserine Pass battles. And McNair came up in a lot of the stuff that I read. And it made me interested to know more about him. And then the next year I went to the School of Advanced Military Studies, did another master's degree, wrote about Army transformation, which was a big deal at the time. And a lot of the material that I looked at to look at how the Army had transformed before came from the period when McNair was the Chief of Staff at General Headquarters and the commander of the Army Ground Forces. So that was where I kind of got exposed to him. And that's how the career and the McNair study intersected. Then I kind of sat for a few years while I did planning during a couple of deployments and finished up my career. And then I left the Army, went to the University of Kansas, started working at SAMS, and decided to pursue my PhD writing about McNair.
And obviously we will go into much more detail about his career as we progress. But
Sure.
I think one of the things my takeaway is that often we look at that 1920s, 30s period by what the Axis were doing and then our reaction to it, and maybe don't think in terms of the British and Americans, Canadians, others actually doing their own development. I mean,
Absolutely.
In many cases, they had to then change and adapt what they were planning because of what the Axis then did, because they were the ones, as we know, folks, who started it. But I think what the Americans and Brits are doing is a little bit overlooked. We spend all our time thinking about Guderian and all the things that are happening there. So I think that study of that period is generally overlooked in our appreciation of World War II. And McNair, as we will find out today, folks, is a real key architect of which way direction the US Army is going and the various pivoting turns it has to do, because in planning for war, you can't just stick to one trajectory. You've got to be adapting to the fact that, oh God, that side have got that now. We need to do something about that. And of course, as we get to Operation Cobra, this whole period where the various arms and branches are not necessarily pulling in the same direction, and there needs to be someone to kind of tie it all together and push everybody off in the same direction. And so anyway, I'm rambling because I haven't done this for 2 weeks and I'm excited to be here.
Sure.
You've come with an amazing set of PowerPoint slides. So we'll put that up on screen now. And folks, what we'll do is we will do questions of pertaining to the information that Mark is talking about at the time as we're going along. So if he's talking about McNair in the 1920s, we'll deal with that as it's going on. If you've kind of got broad questions about big sort of sweeping doctrinal advances, or where does McNair rate in the tally of American heroes, that's probably an end of discussion show question. So I'll monitor as we go along, but we will welcome your interaction. And I think we will all learn something from this. I know I certainly will. So kind of over to you then, Mark, really.
Super. Yeah. So I think one of the first things that I tend to get asked, and I like to try to start any talks about McNair with, is why did I decide to study McNair? As you mentioned, there are folks, and this was one of the warnings that I got when I started talking to people. Obviously I had the background where I'd read about McNair and I found him interesting. When I started talking to people about the project, one of the first warnings I got was, McNair was just a staff officer. He's not important. Find somebody else. Which, I think I can see why people would have thought that at the time. I certainly don't feel that way anymore. Another one was that there was no material on McNair. I was told multiple times, you're just not going to find anything. And I can kind of see why. When I spent the next several years doing research, I actually found way more material than I ever thought I would, and more than I could even use. But at the National Archives in College Park, there is just this one small record group, 337. It's the contents of McNair's office after he died. And it's a small collection, nothing personal in it. It's all work related, no diary, no letters, except business letters, professional correspondence. And so I can see why people had that impression. But then when I started going to other archives, I started finding a ton of material, including a set of scrapbooks and memorabilia that Claire donated to the Library of Congress after he died. Just a ton of material. The third warning I got was that, and I found this really ironic, my perception of McNair going into the project was already pretty negative, because I hadn't really encountered anything but critical assessments of his performance in most of the stuff that I'd read up to that point. But I would have people tell me, assuming that I was going into this as kind of a hagiography, hey, Mark, you're not going to like this guy as much as you do now when you study him. And so I just, after the fact, as I got into the project for a while, I found that really ironic as well. All these well-meaning pieces of advice, I ignored them all and just went ahead and proceeded with the study.
Brilliant.
So I guess the first thing that's kind of useful to do, and this just kind of summarizes some of that, like I talked about, and so here you have one of the first things that I ran into when I really started to dig deeper into McNair. And as you see there, that last 4 years of his career was really all I'd really read about or found written much about it up to that point. But then I saw this and I thought, wow, this is a really diverse range of assignments. And then as I started to find papers, I was able to dig into each of these assignments and look at the details of what he did. And one of the common criticisms that I had read about McNair was he was just an artillery officer. And so he was in over his head, not experienced or prepared for the responsibilities he had in World War II. But as you go through his career, just to highlight some of the things that McNair worked on over the years, he served as the chief of staff of the Provisional Infantry Division, or the Provisional Second Division, it was later called. He both worked on the organization and the equipment of the division and the manpower, but also designed the tests that they did to actually test the division and maneuvers. And that resulted in ultimately the triangular division that was the design for the Army. He developed multiple other equipment tests and training exercises over the years. I had read that McNair should not have run the umpire process at the maneuvers because he wasn't really well prepared to do that. In fact, he'd umpired many maneuvers over the years and had studied it formally at the War College. And then kind of one last bullet that's interesting. His major project at the War College was actually on mobilization issues, peacetime mobilization. And he also compared the systems of reserves in each of the major powers armies at the time to America's. So yeah, throughout his career, as far back as the 20s, McNair's working on things that are directly related to his job as GHQ in the Navy.
I think it came up in a discussion this weekend about people who have very diverse careers, and it can include not just military, but like even in sport. In that you can look at it in two ways. You can look, he's never really good enough to stay anywhere, so he keeps or she gets moved about, or you could say it's someone who has always wanted somewhere new, always moving because there's a need to go somewhere. And if you go into that idea with a preconceived notion, as you're saying, that people who are advising you about this kind of had an idea about McNair without having really done the groundwork, it's easy to kind of go into it blinkered to think that lots of different positions means mediocrity.
For sure.
Or lots of positions can mean acquiring lots of skill bases. So it's an interesting way. If you look at that career there, without knowledge about it, you could say he's just being moved around because they don't know what to do with him. But that could be negative or positive.
For sure. Yeah. And something that I reflect on when I look at this as well is, I'm sure your viewers have heard about the hump, the phenomenon of the hump, where senior company grade or junior field grade officers spent a decade or more in the same grade, which is very foreign to how we do things now in the U.S. Army, which is up or out. But although it was very frustrating for those officers stuck on the hump, they did have the opportunity to spend a really long time operating at that kind of lower field grade level and have assignment after assignment where they got to do different things and build their skills in the range of knowledge that they had in their branch and in the Army in general. So I think McNair benefited from that. And so this next slide, I'm going to go ahead and go to this next one, because what it does is I think it gives you an idea of how McNair became one of those people that didn't move around because they didn't know what to do with him, but he moved because people kept picking him to go places. So this is obviously a really early photo. Right after McNair graduated from West Point, he went out and spent some time out west at some frontier forts, and then he requested a 4-year detail to the Ordnance Branch. He did this because he wanted to hone his skills in mathematics. He had a lot of talent for drawing, for data analysis and design. This was all stuff that he was interested in from his years at West Point. Ordnance Branch accepted the request, and he immediately started doing experimentation and testing. It led to a 1-year assignment at Fort Sill, where they were going through a process of trying to modernize field artillery. And they had collected about a year's worth of firing data, and nobody at Fort Sill knew what to do with it. So they brought McNair on board for this 1-year detail, mostly initially to bring him in to put that raw data in some kind of useful form so they could learn something from it. And then while he was there, as he continued to interact with different folks at Fort Sill, he kept getting brought into more tests. And in some cases, he used his own initiative to start things. So he would get asked to take a look at an existing howitzer. And not only would he do tests to analyze that howitzer, he would design, for example, a new sight. And he would test that sight in the same system, but with his own prototype sight included. And then ultimately, he was assigned battery command back out west in Wyoming, and he ran the 1911 Mountain Artillery Board. And this is where this photo comes from. So in this case, this was an effort to look at the equipment that the mountain artillery was using. And the pack saddles here in the picture was one of those items. The Ordnance Branch had used this pack saddle that had hard case, and they had a design coming out that was a modification, and it was what the Ordnance Branch was going to issue to the field artillery that McNair knew from testing injured the mules, and it also required contractors to load it and unload it, which was obviously cumbersome. So he decided to do a test. He tested 7 different pack saddles that had a range of different configurations. A few of them were variations of the Aparejo, but there were other types as well. And to really do this test and really get some good data, he decided he was going to do a road march. So he took his battery on a 500-mile road march from Wyoming down to Texas and then up into the Rockies. And this set a record for the longest mountain artillery road march to date. And then he also set the highest altitude firing record to date during a test up in the Rocky Mountains. So he came back and he wrote this really long and detailed report. And so here's an example of McNair seeing something he's going to see again in the future. And that is, this report is super detailed, objective, very clear how he came to his conclusions. And he recommends a different pack saddle than the one Ordnance wants to use. Do you think they paid attention to him? No. Ordnance gets to make these decisions. And even with this very detailed, thorough test, Ordnance was determined that their pack saddle was the one that the mountain artillery was going to use. That's something he ran into again multiple times down over the years. So then, moving on from there, there were numerous other interesting assignments in his early years. When I started looking at what he did during the First World War, World War I, as us Americans like to say, Pershing selected McNair to serve as his chief of field artillery training. And this is because Pershing knew McNair when he had served as an Apache scout company in Mexico in 1916. So Pershing remembered McNair from that, brought him on the AEF staff. And when he was promoted to brigadier general in October of 1918, he was the youngest brigadier general in the AEF, the youngest general in the AEF. So here on the right, you see Pershing awarding McNair the Distinguished Service Medal in 1919 before everybody goes home. And then on this next slide, you see Marshal Henri Pétain, also given McNair an award. This is the Officer of the Legion of Honor Award. So I guess what's important to me here is that, and I could go in a lot more about what McNair did during the First World War, but basically it's exposed him to high-level positions, interacting with high-level officers, and having a pretty significant amount of responsibility. And he grew comfortable with that at a pretty young age. So I thought that was pretty neat. And then after the First World War, he had what I think is probably the most surprising and unique assignment of his career. McNair was appointed the G3 operations officer of the Hawaiian Department under General Summerall. Who knew McNair was an operations officer and a planner? And his primary duty was to update the Oahu Defense Plan, which hadn't been updated in a few years. So one of the things that I found as I started going through this, and this is actually, I think it's in the contents of his desk in that record group 337, if I remember correctly, but it's again, another report that has all the results of this test. And as I started looking at this and looking at the detail and everything, I kind of contrasted it with Billy Mitchell's testing of trying to sink a few different types of ships using aerial bombardment. The Ostfriesland was the most famous of those ships that ultimately sank after a couple of days of bombing. And I'm coming to what McNair did, but just to remind people, that Ostfriesland sinking, it didn't happen in anything like wartime conditions. It was all daylight. It wasn't moving. There were rules violations. For example, Pershing wanted smaller bombs tested, 100-pound bombs, et cetera, before the big bombs were used, so they could get a full range of different types of bombs tested. Mitchell's purpose was to sink these things, and he was going to do it quickly, and he went right to the largest bombs. And then there remains a lot of controversy about whether it was really the bombs that sunk the Ostfriesland or whether it was the damage control party that started a flood while they were doing one of the inspections. Regardless, the test had a lot of impact on budget decisions and people's ideas about efficacy of bombing against ships. And because it was associated with Mitchell, of course, it retained a lot of mileage and attention over the years. People still generally remember that test if I mention it. And again, this is a big contrast to McNair. So what McNair wanted to do when he designed or improved, updated the Oahu Defense Plan was to do similar tests. But his purpose was to look at all the different weapon systems he had available in Oahu to defend the island and compare them to figure out what their relative capabilities were. And so this is, I'll just show you a couple of charts that are things you'd find really pretty typical in a defense plan. This is from the 1924, the update that McNair ran. So this is a pretty simple threat range analysis, the kind of thing that you would see in any plan. This next one is a series of range fans, basically for coastal artillery locations on the island and their ranges, and then also locations of the observation posts that they had. So this is where McNair needed data. I mean, he knew the theoretical ranges and where the observation posts were and these things, but what could the systems really do out to those ranges? What were their capabilities really like? And then this next one is very similar, but it's for anti-aircraft artillery. And it also happens to have airfields and then the range fans for the range of the airplanes on those airfields. So the invisible work behind this plan is what was really interesting to me. And this is stuff that I wasn't able to put in my book because you can only have so many photos in a book. So as I started to dig into the report, I started to find some of this background testing that McNair did. So here's an example. This is just an example of how this data was recorded. So essentially what McNair did is he designed a series of tests in which aircraft would bomb targets that were either stationary or moving, either daytime or nighttime, with a range of different bombs. And then they wanted to collect the data and do so in a way that they could compare it for objective assessments of relative capability, right? So this chart has things like the pilots' names, which is important because McNair recruited volunteer air crews and they flew as dedicated air crews. They flew together every time they did a mission or a test. So that minimized error, and it also led to some innovations, a couple of specific innovations in bomb dropping mechanisms in the airplanes they were flying, for example. Then, of course, it records aircraft type, where the unit that it's from, whether it's daytime or nighttime, whether the target's moving or stationary, all these different aspects of the test. So again, already you see a big difference between the way this test is going to be run versus just trying to sink stationary ships as quickly as possible with large bombs, just to prove a concept, essentially. This next slide is just another example of the kind of thing you find in the report, a scatter plot. Again, it charts a lot of detailed data and it shows you where the bombs actually landed. From that, you could then plot these different points on a chart like this. And what this chart is showing you is essentially you have several different kinds of missions that were all plotted on one chart. So you have daylight, 100-pound and 300-pound bombs against stationary and moving targets. And then you also have night 100-pound bombs against fixed targets, probably done for the safety of, so nobody's towing a target at night and having bombs drop nearby. And so by comparing these plots, they could figure out the relative capabilities. Where are the strengths and the weaknesses of these systems, depending on the conditions in which the bombs were dropped. And then I'll just show you one more. And this one's interesting to me because when I worked for 4 years as a planner after I graduated from SAMS, and I found one of the challenging things for me and for my planners was to find ways to operationalize the analysis that we did in ways that made it simple and easy to understand and kind of convey something to people who weren't really involved in all that analysis. And I think this is kind of a neat example. It basically just shows the enemy fleet approaching Oahu, kind of the ranges where you're going to see different elements of that fleet and where they're going to be operating. And then conversely, from the Oahu side, the different capabilities that the Americans had on the island and kind of where they could reach out to. Again, it's a simplified version of the kind of findings in the report, but I think it's a pretty neat way to operationalize it.
And just I'll just a second because I'll address a couple of comments that have come in. And Trent Telenko, who also earlier praised you for just going into this depth about McNair, because he said finally someone who's talking about McNair. And he's saying, he's just, I'll let you can answer this when you want to. I'm going to bet that the McNair report never made it to the Air Corps Tactical School. So we'll leave that one dangling. But the interesting one, Ian Carr, another regular viewer, saying was Mayor an advocate of aviation? But I'm going to kind of answer that myself and then hope I'm correct. It seems to me, from what I'm learning already and having looked at the book, is that he's an advocate of data and what the data tells you. Whereas some of the people at that time are very much that the idea they're pushing is more because of the idea in their head. I'm not saying that's a bad or a good thing, but I'm thinking of the people in France, Britain, and who've got ideas about tank warfare or about aviation or dive bombing. They can or may be good ideas, but it's more about a fertile imagination. He, to me, sounds like a very 21st century guy who is, I'm not going to say what I'm in favor of or not in favor. I'm going to say what the data tells me. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yes. And, and I'll tell you something about that I really reflected on over the years as I studied McNair. And I think that ends up looking a lot like a naivete that you see in his performance at the highest levels during World War II. I think McNair had that objective, data-oriented mindset. what he wanted to find out was, what are these things really capable of, not prove one of them was better than another. And he kind of had this sense that everybody ought to try to do what's right for the Army as a whole, and not advocate a specific branch position or a specific type of equipment that they think is best. Let the data speak for itself, do what's best for the Army. And he kind of approached his interactions with people over the years that way, and never really seemed to understand that, in some ways, maybe he could have been a little more forceful in using some of the approaches that other folks used, rather than just kind of maybe naively hoping that they would do what was the right thing and the best thing and the objective thing, just like he always tried to do.
So I mean, you hanging around people like Pershing, you kind of learn a bit of flair and dynamism and kind of theater almost. And you'd think, along, as I know with my guests on this channel, along with the data comes the ability to share it and the ability to make it exciting. And it seems that if you're brushing, and people have already said, did he come across people like Patton? And someone else said, if you're in the Army in the 20s, you're basically, as a serving officer, you're coming across everybody at some point, because the Army is so relatively small. So you could probably just do a list of all the various people he has some kind of interaction with in that period there, and it would just be a who's who of the US Army in that period. But it would be weird. It's weird if he's not picking up on the idea of, you've got to get a little bit of showmanship as well. You've got a little bit of get a panache to get these ideas the right places. Because particularly because you mentioned that, you said earlier that there's this kind of a recurring theme of stuff he's discovering, interpreting, investigating, being picked up, not getting through. You'd think at some point you go, I've got to find a way of putting on a clown hat and going in there juggling and then giving the data.
That's right. And just as an example, so the question about whether this made it to the Air Corps Tactical School, I don't have any evidence that it had any influence at all over the curriculum at the Air Corps Tactical School, which tells me that it probably didn't. What I do have evidence of is the reactions of the branch chiefs to this. And they were universally negative. Everybody poo-pooed the results, and everybody cherry-picked the report for portions of sentences that would make it sound like McNair was biased. So when McNair said something about aircraft being vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, well, of course they are, right? But when you just put that out there as like an individual statement and then juxtapose it with a positive statement about Coast Artillery, it makes it look like he's trying to sell you one or the other, right? And so the chief of the Army Air Corps senior folks, the chief of Coast Artillery, all these leaders in these different branches that were affected all looked at the report as, well, this didn't advocate my systems or my branch being the most important, so I've got to find a way to poo-poo it. And it had to have been incredibly frustrating for McNair. On the other hand, though, when you see this kind of stuff, and the people who did pay attention and really wanted to learn what McNair's reports could show them, it's no surprise that General Marshall called McNair the brains of the Army. I mean, he really did have some really unique capabilities. He had a very objective and scientific mind. And I think he was the type of person that people recognized very early on. You could give him some really interesting, he was artillery branch. He never served in the Coast Artillery, though. He spent most of his time in either mountain artillery or then later in staff positions. As far as I know, he never served in a Coast Artillery unit. But the fact that he was an artilleryman definitely contributed to these accusations of bias, right? Because anything positive about the artillery was naturally could be presented to look like something that was actually a result of bias on McNair's part.
Okay.
So in case anybody thought we were done with Billy Mitchell, no, we're not done with Billy Mitchell. He's too much fun. So a really interesting bit of karma brought McNair's and Mitchell's paths together in 1925. And interestingly, this is just an aside, but President Coolidge in 25 actually held an aircraft board, which was triggered in large part because of the findings of McNair's report from the Oahu tests. And it didn't find a lot that was, the board didn't find a lot that was all that exciting or interesting, but it did show that there were people who paid attention to the report. It just didn't trickle down to the folks in the actual services that probably needed to look at it a little more objectively. So anyway, Mitchell has his famous trial, and both General Summerall and McNair testified. And what they were there to do was really kind of, help show that some of Mitchell's claims just simply weren't true. So a lot of Mitchell's claims about what was going on in Hawaii that led to some of his claims about his own prescience on things, and also his arguments about things that needed to happen to increase budgets and innovation and the main thing is independence of the Air Corps. What they were able to show was, first of all, when Mitchell did his fact-finding trip to Oahu in, I believe it was 1923, McNair and Summerall never knew he was there. Nobody in the Hawaiian department actually knew Mitchell was there. He didn't ask to see any plans. He didn't ask to go observe any tests. He basically drove around the island on his own, speaking to flying folks, Air Corps folks mostly, and just doing his own assessment of things. So another thing, Mitchell was he liked to claim that he was one of the first people to realize that Japan was a threat and we might have to go to war with them. This is when War Plan Orange is already well developed and very prescient about the threat and what a war with Japan might look like. He made exaggerated claims about non-flying men holding back pilots. It's not that this didn't happen, but it wasn't a problem as widespread as he made it sound. He flat out said there was no defense plan of Oahu, and claimed that he was the first person to see the vulnerability of both Oahu and the Panama Canal. So they were able to provide really damning evidence about just this aspect of Mitchell's claims and the way he kind of conducted himself. That, of course, we all know Mitchell was found guilty. But again, this stuff it just contributed to his legacy, kind of made him a martyr. And again, Mitchell still has a really big effect on historical memory downstream, probably more so than McNair because of his personality and flair and everything else.
And I know you said at the beginning, I'm sorry to interrupt you again, Mark, but the limited papers. McNair is an ideas guy, and I'm going to really oversimplify the point I might annoy you, the kind of Billy Mitchell trial and everything. But, you're seeing the evidence that a trial of someone who's in basically is offering ideas must have left some kind of personal legacy of, what do you do in the future when seeing whether you agree, whether you're sympathetic to Mitchell or not, whether you're on his side or not on his side, whatever position you have about it, being even on the periphery of this thing here is going to leave you with some kind of, you've got to be careful when you present ideas. So do you get any sense that it's a pivotal moment in McNair's career in terms of just what that would have left in his the way he plans things in the future?
That's a great question. So one of the really frustrating things with McNair research was he was a dedicated professional, the first guy in the office, last person to leave, typed his own memos, extremely hardworking, and he didn't really seem to have time for diaries or personal letters.
Right.
So it's hard for me to really know how he felt about his participation in the trial. That said, he's a fairly young officer at this point. There's a big move to try to modernize the Army coming out of World War I. Like you said, all the major powers, militaries are doing their own thing. We're not just all trying to figure out what's going on in Germany. And so there's a big push for innovation, but there's all this branch rivalry. And this, from what I can tell, was definitely McNair's first real experience directly interacting with this kind of high level, rivalry and friction between the services or branches. So it had to have left a big impact on him, but I don't have any evidence to
no, it's just fascinating that, as we said, at the beginning of those who know a little bit about him, defining him by being just a staff officer and the circumstances of his death, but actually being involved in some pretty major things before that are going to have lasting effects. And I'm holding you back, and I want to hear the next bit. It's brilliant stuff, and people are loving it, and good viewing numbers. So fantastic. So keep on going.
That's great to hear. Excellent. So I want to kind of quickly go through one more thing that I spent a lot of time reading about, and this is just a brief case study on innovation at the Field Artillery School. So there was a long period of innovation that was sparked essentially by the need to, and really after World War I, this became really clear. There's this vision that the modern battlefield is going to be more fluid, a lot more mobility. And based on what we saw in our World War I experience, the artillery just wasn't ready to meet that challenge of how to support the other combined arms in a mobile, fluid battlefield. And of course, there were a lot of technological innovations and other things that came along at the right time to kind of help them, the artillery branch and the Army as a whole, achieve that goal. But one of the major periods of innovation culminated right in this period when McNair was assigned to Fort Sill as the deputy commandant. And the deputy commandant is essentially responsible for curriculum, and the gunnery department and the tactics department both work under that person, the commandant. And what you had at the time was you had this problem where the tactics department was full of traditionalists who believed that the artillery batteries should control their own fires. They should adjust their own fires. So their view was that the idea of battalion level massed fires was just a non-starter, and they would do everything they could to suppress any ideas about trying to go forward with that. McNair thought there was a lot of potential and thought that it needed to be tested, and so did, for example, Jacob Devers here on this slide. He was the chief of the gunnery department, as you can see there, for 25 to 29. And Devers really kind of helped get the ball rolling. And one of the things that he was really focused on was trying to figure out how to begin the innovative work of figuring out how to support this more mobile battlefield. And he worked both in innovation in firing procedures and calculations, but also in trying to write updated doctrine. And he kind of got the ball rolling. And so McNair had a good sort of start in the gunnery department when he showed up. And the next officer to come along and run the gunnery department was a fellow named Carlos Brewer. As you can see here, he's in the lower left. So Brewer picked up where Devers left off, and his main focus was how do we accomplish this mass battalion fires goal? It's something we really want to be able to do. And to do the testing for this, they actually had to come in on essentially as volunteers on the weekend and do their tests to try to keep attention down. And so some of the things that they looked at while Brewer was around, they looked at flash sound ranging, which was, one kind of rudimentary method to try to start figuring out how to adjust. One of the big challenges was when you have batteries firing from different locations and observers making adjustments from different locations, the calculations get complicated pretty quickly. But they worked a lot on that, on observed error adjustment, and they made a lot of progress. And then right around the time that Brewer was going to depart, they discovered a book called Field Guns in France by an officer named Fraser Tytler. I've never been able to get my hands on a copy of this thing. I'd love to. I just know that it was something that Brewer was really excited about, and he passed that along to his successor, who kind of kept things rolling. And folks will probably remember this person as well, Orlando Ward. He ran the gunnery department from 31 to 33, so that last period of McNair's tenure. He had some lucky breaks. There were some improved radios that they received. They made a couple of pretty big breaks. They had a couple of big breaks in how to combine adjustment data. And by the time he was done, they essentially had a proto-FTC. And that proved obviously to be a massive innovation in World War II for the Army ground forces. As everyone knows, artillery was a massively important asset and extremely effective. So what did McNair have to do with all this? Well, as a deputy commandant, he had to tamp down resistance within the tactics department and support the gunnery department. And he was kind of left on his own to do this. He kind of had to fight this battle. And so as I looked through the documents from this period, there were all kinds of memos where either he's trying to get resources that the gunnery department needs, bringing in equipment, bringing in people to help with experience in different aspects of the problem. And then you find other documents where he's basically tamping down the resistance to it. And he wrote annual reports that highlighted the successes of the gunnery department so that they could go out to the larger field artillery community, and it wasn't just something that was a secret there at Fort Sill. And so I kind of went from not knowing that McNair was involved in all of this to wondering what would have happened if he hadn't have been. If a traditionalist had been running the curriculum at the field artillery school during this period, they could have set back innovation in mass fires for years. McNair wasn't the only person who could have done it, but he was definitely a right person for the job, if not the right person for the job. And he really kind of helped that process go forward as quickly as it could with the momentum that it had. So just a really very important fella. And I mentioned that I looked at Kasserine Pass in that first master's degree, which I don't encourage anyone to go read because I was young and it's not very good. But I did get interested in Kasserine Pass. And if you recall, going past that initial couple of days of kind of embarrassing defeat and rout, the Americans put together a really solid defense in depth with artillery, pre-registered fires. And when Rommel made his last push to try to break through, they stopped him cold. And Rommel retreated because he was basically out of tanks. And it was the capability of this artillery and the mass adjustable fires that really made the difference. And there are accounts from after the battle where German prisoners of war are asking, can we see this automatic artillery that the Americans are using? We didn't know such a thing existed. So the other couple of things about Kasserine Pass that'll just dovetail into a couple of things that'll come up later. The problems at Kasserine Pass certainly aren't, I'm not trying to minimize those, and McNair recognized them as well. And it prompted him to give his Kill or Be Killed speech. It's kind of a nickname for the speech that he gave on Armistice Day in 1942. The problems that kind of led up to the challenges they were seeing in the training that led up to these issues at Kasserine Pass, he's already talking about that stuff with his Kill or Be Killed speech. And then after the actual Kasserine Pass battles, he goes to Tunisia and visits the front. And that ends up being a pretty big event in his career as well. So
just to interrupt, loving the fact you mentioned Davis and Brewer and these other people there. Peter Caddick Adams apparently goes over. I haven't read Victory in the West yet. I've got my copy of it, but he talks about this, and I don't know whether he mentions McNair's involvement in it. There's only so much, as you said, you could put in one book. You're being advised that the Fraser Tytler book is available on Libris for $17.61. It is a reprint, so someone found that for you. So that maybe has made your day. I would take you back to what you said about what would have happened if McNair hadn't been there during this process. And so what do you think he brought to this process beyond the data understanding? What is there a single thing that you can put it down to that you would say is the quality he brings?
Well, so I'll say it goes back to what you said earlier. It was his objectivity. I mean, McNair was determined not to let the tactics department suppress this innovative activity that was going on. He didn't promise anybody anything. He wasn't trying to prove that something already existed or that there was something that would be capable of something in the future, even though he hadn't been able to test or prove that. He just knew that there was a problem that they needed to solve. And he had identified an operational problem. He wrote about it. There were articles that he had in the Field Artillery Journal from while he was on the AEF staff during World War I, where he talked about how to put mobile guns that could actually move forward with the infantry as they advanced. And it assessed the problems with that and what sort of things would need to happen to be able to do that more effectively. So he'd been thinking about this stuff for a long time, and he knew there was a problem that needed to be solved, and he was just determined not to let that innovation get suppressed. And then I think the other thing is he had the personality and the force of will to keep these two kind of different perspectives separate and not let it become a problem that turned toxic for the Field Artillery School itself, which, I mean, if you think about it, that was probably a big challenge. These folks all work for the same organization, but they're really at each other's throats over these ideas that they're arguing about. And he was somehow able to keep everybody moving forward with their mission and still allow this innovation to take place.
So in a sense, you feel he's always felt he served the data as opposed to serving a particular branch or a particular department or even a particular senior commander. It's all about what the data says and what the reports say.
I think so.
And in an era when, as we said earlier, or I said earlier, it is lots of ideas coming out, and we so often we talk in the 1940s developments of Churchill having ideas for stuff, and it's in a sense he's kind of the one providing the ideas. Sound sexy, but he's the one who kind of provides the set of data at the back of the presentation folder. People go, yeah, that does make sense. The actual raw proof, the chart that says this is how it would actually work, and I guess that's why that kind of work in military history study can get overlooked because it isn't as good. It's a bit dull. It's
That's right.
it's like having a good PowerPoint and a bad PowerPoint.
That's right. And he knew how to put information together in that way to persuade senior officers to support him in his efforts to keep this kind of work going as well. But you're right, it doesn't translate to really exciting or sexy history. You know, a lot of the things I ended up writing about in my book are really about the strategic level Army effort to modernize and prepare itself for the next war, and McNair's role in that. A lot of these were, you know, high level sort of strategic issues that dealt more with our ability to mobilize, to form units and deploy, and then things like how are we going to integrate all the services behind, you know, a joint approach to war, not just looking at how the Army is going to fight itself and within its own branches. So,
and we can see with what you've talked about, from the pack mules transport to the defense of islands to use of artillery, he's gaining solid, good practical experience in various different fields that
that's right.
Theoretically will all come back together at a certain point when all those things need to come together. And, you know, as we'll get to Cobra in July, you know, that's that Normandy side of things is bringing all the things we've got, bringing all the tools we have in the toolbox together to try and provide that breakthrough. And
sure,
he's a really, I'm really fascinated by him. I you know, it's like, yeah, McNair, yeah, you know, but This is amazing stuff and people are loving it. So I'm handing it back to you.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, this is what kept me going all those years, going to different archives. Each time I found another collection, it was just, wow, another gold mine. So I mentioned briefly, you know, I had a bunch of things that I thought we could talk about from the World War II period. But in the interest of time, I kind of kept it focused on a couple of things just to help us get into Cobra. I mentioned the Kill or Be Killed speech. This isn't, I don't think this is McNair doing that actual speech because the dates don't correspond unless the date on the back of the image is incorrect. The speech was actually given on November 11th of 42, but this is essentially a picture of him doing the same thing, just on a different date. I've got an extract of it here on this next slide. It's worth going online and finding the entire speech and reading it. The main point is similar to when the U.S. Government finally authorized the media to show images of dead American soldiers on TV in late 1943, because they knew that we needed to motivate and, you know, the civilian populace behind the war effort. The same thing here. McNair's using language about killing and hating the enemy that the public wasn't used to hearing, if they'd even heard it at all. But what he's speaking not just to the public, but also to our soldiers about the need to battle harden. And I think, you know, this is one of the things that the Kasserine Pass case study makes so clear, is that these were not battle hardened troops. So not only were there a lot of tactical errors that were made, and that there were errors at the operational level, bad intelligence, all these different things that you read about. Another big problem was that these soldiers just weren't battle hardened yet. And after this series of battles, you had a bunch of battle hardened soldiers that moved forward into the next campaigns. So I think this speech really shows that although McNair can come across as a data nerd or an egghead, maybe, he's also a blood and guts soldier. He's an old school soldier. He never showed any physical weakness or lack of bravery. He loved being around the troops. He loved being in the field. And I think he really understood that soldiers needed difficult, realistic training to be able to be effective in combat. And I think this just illustrates that really well.
Yes, it's a great bit of if you saw that attributed to various other people, you wouldn't be surprised. Now I know a bit more about McNair. It's almost, it doesn't sound like the McNair you've been talking about, but it's proving what an incredibly multifaceted, multi-skill sets type of guy he is.
That's right. So interestingly, that bravery might have gotten him in a little bit of trouble. So let's see here. This map, everybody can probably already see the stains on it. When I went to the National Archives in College Park for the very first time to do McNair research, and I looked at record group, I think this is in 337 and maybe one of the first or second box. Before I got started, anybody who's done World War II research at the National Archives probably knows Tim Neminger and what a fantastic archivist he is, and how incredibly helpful he could be. And he was very helpful to me. And he told me before I got into any of the boxes that he had found this incredible discovery. He didn't tell me what it was, but he said when he was looking at the papers I was going to look at, he found what he called his single greatest find at the National Archives. And so I thought, well, that's exciting. That's a great way to get started.
That's a bold statement.
A bold statement. So I got into the first set of papers, and in a little manila envelope glued on the inside of a folder, you could easily just miss it because it's totally nondescript. Open it up, take out this map, and it's folded up about this big. And I unfold it, and I thought, well, okay, I can kind of see what it is. It's in North Africa. It's graphics for a small unit attack against a stationary defense. But then I noticed the stains, and I thought, well, what the heck is that? And when you run your fingers across it, it's raised. And it didn't take me long to figure out that this is the actual map that McNair was holding in his hands when he was on a ridge observing this attack in Tunisia. And a German spotter identified his party, and incoming artillery rained down, and a couple of splinters got him, one in the elbow and one in the skull. And so somebody had the wherewithal to preserve this map and make sure that it got back to him. And he had it in his office, like I said, in a desk drawer until the day that he died. So it led to a pretty interesting conversation and debate between some archivists and some museum historians about, should this be in a folder in the archives, or should it be under glass somewhere? But for me, I think as a young historian just getting started on my PhD, the main thing it did to me was just really provide motivation to, it just gave you a sense of how real history can be to you when you have the right artifact, or you get to interact with the right people, that kind of thing. It was just a really cool thing to come acrost. The letter to the right.
What happens later on, especially because this is, it's quite a piece. Yeah,
it really is. And the letter to the right there is just a letter from Ike, wishing him a quick recovery and noting that he, true to form, after having a bit of shrapnel removed from his skull that was less than an inch from his brain, he only spent a few days before he went home, and by the time he got back in the States, he was back at work the next Monday morning. And the rumor, I've never found a document to substantiate it, was that he refused anesthesia when they took the splinters out of him. So just an example of the kind of person that McNair could be. Definitely a very brave person. So, and this, like you said, makes a very interesting segue, because what the heck was McNair doing at the front on July 25th, 1944? So, as we know, the Americans have been slogging through the hedgerows in a very, very slow pace, yards per day for weeks. Monty's Goodwood has just concluded, a week prior or so.
And let's not go down the rabbit hole of what that was all about. We will be covering that in the future, folks. Operation Cobra comes up with Arthur later in the week. But yeah, they're well summarized there.
Yeah, perfect. So and the one thing I will say about that is, one of the reasons that Cobra ends up being so successful is that Montgomery's operational plan for the Battle of Normandy, in which his operational design was that he would hold the bulk of the German strength around Caen, and thereby allow the Americans to work their way south against less opposition. And so when Cobra comes along, there are only 2 panzer divisions, greatly weakened panzer divisions, facing 7th Corps and 1st Army, whereas there are 6 up around Caen and still fighting the 21st Army Group. So the conditions are pretty well set, but Bradley knows it's really important that we get this mission moving, get a breakthrough, and really start to move forward, particularly because we've got to get more divisions onto the beaches. And we also need to get the logistics throughput issue sorted out. And so we can't do those things until we really get this front moving. So this chart is pulled out of the Green Books. It's one of the easier ones to see. Some of the Green Book charts can get pretty busy. But you can see the Saint-Lô-Perriers Road that runs kind of a little bit northwest to southeast, but it's generally an east-west road. And then just below that, you see the rectangular box about 2,500 by 7,000 feet. So the Americans are just north of this road. The target area is just south of the road. And they're facing Panzerlehr Division right in the box, and then the other units designated there. And so Bradley decides to stake his hopes on this massive bombardment. There is artillery involved in the bombardment, but because at this time the Americans are suffering a really significant shortage of artillery ammunition, so they couldn't rely on the artillery as much as usual. And so Bradley decided the aerial bombardment was really going to need to be spectacular to enable this breakout to occur. And because he knew how important it was going to be, he was willing to accept a lot of risk to make it happen. Also, a couple more conditions going on here. The first U.S. Army group, which is a fictional headquarters that's basically part of the Operation Fortitude deception, which is part of the Operation Bodyguard deception. FUSAG is still working underneath Patton's command, and the Fortitude deception is still holding around 20 German divisions up around Calais. And as long as Fortitude is working, this is another opportunity. It opens up a greater opportunity to achieve a breakthrough. But Patton has to deploy with Third Army over the beaches in Normandy to get into the fight. So with Patton leaving England, there's a new commander needed, right? Coincidentally, just weeks before this, Generals Eisenhower and Marshall were talking about the need for field army commanders. And they talked about a couple of folks, and McNair was on the short list. And their logic there were two arguments. One was that he was the commander of the Army Ground Forces, but his training mission was essentially done at this point. Divisions are deploying to the front, everything's moving, and there aren't a whole lot more training responsibilities that McNair's got to worry about. So he's going to be better suited or better used at the front. And, again, this is one of those things that I really found it interesting when I read about this, that they selected him to be a field army commander, which just belies any impression that the man was a very narrow-minded field artilleryman.
Yeah.
That's right. They had a lot of confidence in him. And even though he was stone deaf, they selected him for command. Now, the command they initially thought about was 15th Army, but 15th Army didn't actually make it into the theater until January of 45. So they deployed it without a commander. And then while it was waiting, eventually they assigned a commander to it. In the meantime, though, they needed this FUSAG commander right away. McNair was there. And the other thing he had was one of the reasons Fortitude was working so well was because it was Patton. And if Patton's, obviously that makes sense. A guy like him to lead the Calais invasion, sure, makes perfect sense. So you needed somebody with at least similar name recognition value to kind of keep the deception going, and McNair fit that bill as well, although obviously not to the degree that Patton did. So he's en route to the theater to be the first U.S. Army Group commander, and to help support the deception, Eisenhower decides to send him to the front so that he'll get some media coverage, visiting units at the front before proceeding to take command. And naturally, with this big operation coming up, McNair needs to go see it. So he decides to go observe Operation Cobra. So a little bit of stuff on the bombardment next, I think. Oh, I skipped a slide there. Gave away the ending. A couple things on the bombardment that I find really interesting. This is a little bit harder chart to see, but it's right out of the planning products from the air planners. If you look carefully there at the top, you can see this north-south arrow, this arrow pointing south, and that's 180-degree due south flight route. So, and I mentioned how Bradley was willing to accept a lot of risk to get this really big bombardment that he wanted. So a couple of those aspects of risk. The air planners wanted a 3,000-meter safety distance from the edge of the target area to the front line of troops. Bradley wanted to reduce that to 800 meters. And in negotiations, it ended up being 1,200. And to help alleviate that a little bit, artillery was going to range some of the closest targets to push the air targets a little bit further into the box. But it was around 800 to 1,000 meters was all the safety distance they had. Another thing was Bradley didn't want large bombs used because he didn't want the target area cratered, because that would slow down mobility through it when the exploitation started. So he had a meeting with his air and ground planners around a week before this. And it ended up, or maybe just 4 or 5 days actually, it ended up being kind of an ineffective meeting, because these issues were raised, and Bradley thought he had agreement on the flight route issue. He thought this highway that runs parallel to the target area is a perfect navigation aid for the pilots. And as a pilot, I completely agree. There's nothing better than a straight road going off to the horizon to follow. The problem was you can't put flights of bombers adjacent to each other, flying abreast in any kind of size when you're flying up the narrow section of the target area. So that would make the bombing take just so long. It would go way beyond the time allocated for the mission. So the airplaners knew that they couldn't fly this parallel route, at least not with the heavy bombers. They did fly it with the fighter bombers and some of the mediums, but they knew they couldn't do it with the heavies. But somehow Bradley left this planning conference thinking that they had agreed to the north-south or to the parallel route as opposed to the north-south route. He also thought that he had gotten a commitment that they would only use 100-pound bombs, when in fact they ended up using 260-pound general purpose bombs as well, which also surprised him. So as we know, I mean, the first day on the 24th, you have let's see here. Actually, there were a couple of things I wanted to mention, but I'll mention those before we get to the 25th because it's more important. But on the 24th, you have the mission scheduled, but Lee Mallory, the air marshal, is in Normandy. He sees that the weather is bad, and he tries to make a call back to the headquarters to tell the bombers, hey, don't come. And it doesn't get through in time to stop most of the bombers. Now, when the fighter bombers arrive and the heavies arrive, most of them depart without dropping any bombs because of the weather and the conditions. But when the heavies roll in, they end up dropping their bombs. And because, the conditions were really poor, you had one bombardier who accidentally released his bombs early. And because they fly in chalks and all the other bombardiers just release with the lead bombardier, one flight of heavies dropped their bombs right on top of the front lines. And the 30th Division suffered 90% of the casualties, 25 dead and 131 wounded. So obviously this was a huge blow. Bradley was disheartened and furious. He assumed that this would mean more than a one-day delay for Cobra. It gave away the element of surprise, for example. He didn't know how badly it was going to demoralize the troops, how severe the casualties were going to end up being. But Collins, and it's important to remember that Bradley and Collins, this was their baby. They basically planned this, the two of them. So this is their baby, and Collins understands this mission better than anybody. And there's a lot of low-level initiative happening, a lot of Auftragtaktik, as my friend Rick Herrera would say it wasn't, because it was actually just American Mission Command. A lot of initiative. And Collins realized that one way or another, he's going to have to reestablish the starting conditions for the mission. So he might as well go ahead and try to reestablish his original front line. And he tells his divisions to attack. So while Bradley's trying to assess the damage from this bombing issue, Collins is taking the initiative to push his units forward. It takes them hours, but they do, by the end of the night, they do get into their original frontline positions. And when Bradley finds this out, he decides, okay, let's try again on the 25th. A couple of additional mitigation measures that they decided to take in place. There was no way to change the north-south flight route for the heavy bombers. It just, he knew at this point they're going to come in that way again. So they said, well, let's use some yellow sight panels at different points in the target area. Let's use red smoke to mark the edges of the target area. They moved that line back a little bit further where artillery would hit some targets instead of the bombers, in theory, if they all hit their targets right. But as soon as the bombs started to drop, you're churning up dust. The explosions are scattering the red smoke. The dust is obscuring the target area. And many of the planes come in and couldn't see the road. And again, you had quite a bit more, many more bombs dropped on top of the American lines than on the 24th. This time you have 111 killed and 490 wounded. And again, this is the majority from the 30th Division. That's a higher rate of casualties they had on any day in the war inflicted by the enemy. Their worst casualties of the war in one day was this event. And one battalion in the 9th Division lost its entire command group, and another battalion had to be hurriedly moved up to take its place in the attack. But again, as we all know, although there are people thinking that, okay, this is a terrible disaster and it's killed this operation in place. The low-level initiative going all the way down to division and combat command level commanders is what kept this thing going. And progress was slow, but it was notable over the coming days, and it ended up being a great success. But before we get there, let's talk about General McNair, unless you have a question.
I just want to backpedal on a couple of things you say. One is, it's already come up. Gary mentioned it about, I can't go back now, find it, about Bradley's interpretation of, there we are. There's a lot of controversy about whether Bradley told the truth afterwards regarding what the air planners told him. So I'm interested when Steve Ossad comes on, I think it's tomorrow, and talks about Bradley in Cobra, whether he says exactly the same version of the events as you, because there is no absolute definitive version you can find archivally, as far as I understand it. There's always going to be a certain amount of interpretation with how people knew and what they knew about it, and that their each take on these various meetings. So
that's right.
That we don't really know. The other thing, just can we just absolutely clarify what McNair's role in this was? Because people, there are books being written saying he's there in an air advisory capacity. He's there to kind of oversee ground air cooperation. There's also, as you said, there's an element of it sightseeing before this new command. So when I know you may be getting to this, but on July the 25th, what if you were to ask him why was he there, what would he give as the reason?
To watch. He was a dignitary. He was an incoming senior field army commander coming to the front to observe troops in combat before taking command. And so so on the 24th, he's driving around the battlefield area. Now, he did check in at First Army headquarters. They knew he was there. He wasn't, but he was driving around at the front with his pilot and his aide in a car, just the three of them. And so he found his own position to observe the incoming bombers from. And nobody knew exactly where he was when the first close call happened on the 24th. Luckily, he was able to drive back to the First CP, the First Army CP, and let them know what had happened and that he was okay. And while he was there, and interestingly, so I mentioned that McNair was stone deaf. On the 24th, when they were out driving around, he hadn't actually gotten in a foxhole yet. They had parked the car, and his aide was out looking for a good position for him to watch from. And while the aide is out looking around, the pilot and McNair are in the car, and the bombers start to come in, and bombs are approaching their position. The pilot knew McNair well enough to know he was deaf, and sure enough looked, and McNair didn't even hear the bombs coming. I guess he didn't feel them either, or he couldn't feel how close they were. And so the pilot actually had to push him out of the car to get him to cover. So that's a pretty close call, and you'd think that might have made him think twice about going back. But he rolled back to the First Army CP, and just as determined as ever, when he heard the mission was going to be rescheduled for the next morning, yep, I'm going back and watching again. And this is where I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the work that I've been focusing on over the last several years, because one of the last people to see McNair alive was General William H. Simpson. Everybody who knows who he was, raise your hand. I bet a lot of hands don't come up right away. This is another fellow that has really kind of been neglected by historians. And I don't know why I like these kind of projects, but I'd love to explore things that seem really
we love niche, undiscovered, but
that's right. It's fun
without it being secret, uncovered. That we don't use those taglines, but just good, solid, important history that hasn't been done before is just like catnip to us, Mark.
Oh my goodness! Exactly. That's right. So this is I love this photo. Now, the first time McNair ran into General Simpson was in Mexico back in 1916, like I talked about, when Pershing also worked around him. Then Simpson commanded both the 30th and the 35th Division in the interwar period. And then he was made commander of the 12th Corps. And at the Tennessee maneuver area, McNair came to inspect his corps and observe training. And you can see here General McNair in the middle and General Simpson to the right. And they're having a very serious conversation about footwear with this soldier. And it's just a terrific picture. But this inspection is the interaction with Simpson that convinced McNair that Simpson should be a field army commander. And it was after this inspection that McNair recommended him for field army command. And that's why he ended up 9th Army commander in Northwest Europe. So they ran into each other at the 1st Army CP. Simpson's army had not yet come over the beach, but he's also in theater trying to learn as much as he can about, running a field army in combat. He had already been around 1st Army CP for several days, and he needed to get back to his headquarters, and already had checked out of his trailer, which McNair was going to move into, and already had his flight going back scheduled, and he needed to get out of there. So after an evening conference, he's about to leave, and McNair stopped him and said, hey, Simp, let's chat. And he said, look, I've got a great location to observe the bombing from in the morning. Why don't you stick around and come with me? And Simpson, I really got to get back. And McNair tries to convince him, and Simpson says no. And this is all from Simpson's interviews after the war. He says, no, I can't do it. I can't go with you, but I'd love to. And instead, he took McNair by the arm because it's dark, and McNair's got to walk back to his trailer. And Simpson knows he's deaf, and he's worried that if a sentry challenges him, he won't hear it, and he might get shot in the middle of the night by a well-meaning sentry. So he escorted McNair back to his trailer, said goodnight, and off he went. And like I said, because McNair traveled to the front the next morning with his driver and his pilot, Simpson may have been one of the last people to see him alive. Just a really fascinating sort of, how these people's careers seem to keep touching each other over the years. So when the bombing happens on the morning of the 25th, McNair's driver and aide, I can't remember how many yards away they are. I don't know if I've ever seen an exact number, but they were a fair distance away from the foxhole that McNair was in. And when the bombs landed on top of them, they came out from under the dust, and McNair's foxhole was gone. McNair was gone. They searched for him. They couldn't find any sign of him. They went to, they tried aid stations. They went back to the rear, reported back to the 1st Army CP and said, we can't find General McNair. General Hodges was the deputy commander of 1st Army at this time, so 12th Army Group hadn't happened yet. And he was in the CP, and so he said, well, once the situation dies down enough, we'll go look for him. And so a little later, Hodges and his aide went with McNair's aide and pilot. They went back to the general area, and soon they heard that someone had found a general's body up the road. So the distances that I've seen written down, I think Sylvan, Bradley's aide, said it was about 2,000 yards. I've also seen something more on the order of 200 or 150 yards, depending on who you ask. I think the latter is a lot more realistic. But whichever distance it was, when they got to McNair's body, they were only able to identify him by his rank insignia. So it was a devastating day. It was a really tough day. In addition to the loss of a great general, it was also an operational concern, right? Because we've got to keep fortitude going. And so now, that this new fortitude commanders, if people find out he's dead, if the Germans find out he's dead, that could bring the lie to the whole thing. So they suppressed the fact that McNair was killed at the front until they could bring in General DeWitt, who ended up taking over Fusag to allow that deception to continue. Claire McNair was notified. She was actually in a gymnasium rolling bandages for the Red Cross when someone came in and took her out and told her what had happened. This class ring was later found at the site, or near the site where they found his body, and that is McNair's class ring. It's now up at West Point. And just a couple other interesting and kind of sad facts. McNair had one son. His name was Doug. He was a major fighting on Guam. And about 10 days after General McNair was killed around St. Lo, his son Doug was shot by a sniper and killed in Guam, his only son. So imagine the tragedy for Claire McNair, losing her husband, and then 10 days later, her only son. And you'll see a photo of McNair's granddaughter here in a minute. So I guess the last thing I'll say really about McNair until we get into questions and stuff is that he was promoted posthumously to 4-star general. And I don't know how many of your viewers have read about this, but there were a number of general officers, lieutenants general, and who were never promoted to 4-star during the war. And there was a big push, for the few years after the war to get that done. And the congressional, an act finally made that happen for I think it was about 10 or 15 general officers. McNair was one of them. Okay, so that's kind of what I wanted to say about McNair's death, although we can revisit it if we want to. But I did have a little bit more about the exploitation if you want to get into that.
Yeah, no, but I want to address, as a Brit living in Normandy to an American who studied this from the McNair, but also Bradley point of view. I think one of the things, my observations about A, McNair's loss, and B, the friendly fire of the 30th Division and some of the 4th and what have you, is that I think that has left a legacy of people not looking at the result from the German side. Because when you read what's happening in Fritz Beilin's headquarters, and I regularly go and stand in front of the chateau where he was, just slightly outside the rectangle there. He's almost seeing vehicles under his command bouncing across fields because they're being hit by multiple shells. And we'll get into this with Bradley later in the week. The volume of shells hit by those that dropped by those bombers on that ridiculously small rectangle in the grand scheme of things is just insane.
Thousands of tons of bombs.
Tons, and even when you drive through it today, you still don't see any really old trees because everything is post World War II. Right. And I think, I'm asking you, has that burden of the friendly fire, and the friendly fires, I'm not belittling the tragedy of it, but when you're talking about, the 7th Corps going to start launching and 8th Corps going to be following a few hours later, we're talking an event in which hundreds of thousands are going to be involved, right. and a few hundred killed at the beginning. And people will think he's being grossly insensitive to the loss of the. I'm not. I'm just saying, in an organized operation of this level, it's not an absolute disaster, that friendly fire. Even McNair's death, in terms of Operation Cobra, and the analogy I use is it's like a steamroller starting. It doesn't. When it starts, you can barely see it moving. And I feel that's how Cobra starts. At the beginning, it's like, is it going anywhere? Is it doing anything? But once that steamroller started, and it is started by the bombing, and then as we know, the infantry elements start moving across that road, and the first advance is a little bit cagey, a little bit. And it's like, come on, guys! Bradley's wanting it to go move forward. But there's once a steamroller starts, there's kind of no stopping it, and then it starts. It's the snowball rolling, isn't it? And then a few hours in, second armored, what have you, start making advances. But I think, would you agree that the friendly fire has tended to leave American historians not looking at the results from the German point of view?
Yeah, definitely. So I've read that Bayerlein at one point described the Panzer Air Division as no longer existing as a functional unit. I mean, yes, the effects of the bombing were even better than Bradley or Collins could have hoped for, I think. There also, I completely agree, there is no way that there weren't going to be friendly fire, fratricide casualties in this bombing. And even though Eisenhower swore to never use heavy bombers in a close air support role, a bombing in support of friendly troops at a close distance like that, he said he would never let that happen again. Bradley said he would never let it happen again. But even though they used larger safety distances and more safety measures in the later campaigns of the war, you still had fratricide accidents routinely. But it's sort of a taboo kind of situation. There's something about fratricide that it's not just the number of deaths, but the symbolic nature of it. I mean, the Americans are talking about the American Luftwaffe, right? That they're more afraid of the American airplanes and their ability to kill them than they are the Germans, which obviously part of the reason that the Germans don't have a lot of air power left at this point.
Well, that's the joke is left in Britain and Canada is if the Britons are bombing, some people ran. If the Canadians are bombing, a few people, the Germans, if the Americans start bombing, everybody ran. I'm paraphrasing the joke there because there are other versions of it I've read over the years. And these are the kind of legacies we're left with from this.
That's right.
And I feel the German side, and it's the other division, the 263rd or it is, the German division, it's already on its knees, and Biden sends out dispatch riders, and he's absolutely having officers coming back completely doolally. I mean, they've witnessed, they've been in this box, and James Holland talks about this in his book in quite length in a chapter about just the mental effect on any German who's anywhere near that rectangle. They have been punch drunk for bombardment is something the world have never really seen, and so, but you just don't tend to read that. It all in American history, it always gets on there, as you said, this very emotive subject of the friendly fire. Kind of what a tragedy, and yes, it is a tragedy, but I'm interested because you put your slide up there. I'll let you give your thoughts on the breakout.
Sure. Yeah. So, I guess one of the things, and we've already touched on this. So Russ Weigley famously said that the preparatory bombing was important, but that the Cobra offensive probably would have been successful even if the bombing hadn't been nearly as effective. And I completely agree with that assessment. What Weigley credits a lot of the success of this to, and I think, as I mentioned already, lower level commander initiative is obviously a massive part of it. Collins, Maurice Rose, you had a lot, Barton, you had a lot of fantastic officers who saw the situation and exploited it at their own initiative and kept that steamroller moving. So I think that is obviously super important. But Weigley talks about the fact that concentration, as a principle of war, concentration was such an important factor. And the interesting thing about that is you can't be a major proponent of the idea of concentration and also be a major proponent of the broad front strategy. So even though the American generals might have understood that, I mean, 7th Corps was massively overstrength at this point. It was almost like a small field army. And so this concentration just enabled that steamroller to develop an amount of momentum that even at full strength, the units at the strength that they were on the 24th, Weigley doesn't think that they could have stopped this from happening, and I don't either. But on the other hand, the bombardment obviously did make it a lot easier. There were also some other advantages that the Americans had. The Peninsula Air Division was at around 50% of its strength in both equipment and personnel, and the personnel were severely beat up from all the weeks of campaigning. The American troops had gotten replacements. They'd gotten fresh equipment. The Americans had the coolant device, the Rhino. So this was the first time they'd used it against the Germans. In fact, when Bradley learned of the Rhino and he saw the tests of it, he gave orders for it not to proceed any further than a certain point because he wanted the coolant device, the Rhinos, to have a shock effect on the Germans when they saw us punching through hedgerows faster than we'd ever been able to do before. Pete Casada, I wasn't clued into Pete Casada until embarrassingly late in my PhD studies. And this guy has got to be one of the most important people in the Battle of Normandy and in the entire Northwest Europe campaign.
Absolutely deserving of a show or a week of shows, I think.
For sure. Just an incredible. But his armored column cover method that they developed in conjunction with the armored units was just absolutely critical as well. A tank could call his air cover and ask if the road in front of them is clear. And if not, the bombers would take care of it and say, okay, you can go now. Pretty amazing and a massive development. So you look at all these things, and oh, by the way, the terrain wasn't as good as it maybe was further east, but it was dry, and they hadn't had dry terrain in quite a while. So that also made a big difference. And once they had cut this Saint-Lô-Paris highway, now the Germans' ability to laterally move to reinforce, difficult points in their line, it was pretty much taken away. Because the Germans at this point really relied on road movement to do that, and there were lots of gaps in their line even before the preparatory bombing. So based on all that stuff, I think it was likely to succeed even if the preparatory bombing hadn't been.
I agree with you, and at the same time I disagree with them. I am, of course, unqualified for this. You're the one with the military service and the PhDs to back up your argument. But if you look at for example, this is when we're particularly the advances using the Ritchie boys, the German Jews who are interrogating Germans. If you look at what the Germans are saying, the German officers captured in Cobra, which are serious numbers when you get down towards Avranches with 8th Corps, is that I would absolutely agree that it's the ground, it's that push through in that narrow slot by the armor and the infantry that makes the tactical difference. But I would maintain it's the bombing that has the effect on the Germans are thinking we're not going to come out of this one okay. Whereas if they hadn't been bombed, I think they have more of a morale. I think when you look at what the Germans are saying, that the bombardment put them on that. I don't think this is going to go our way. The Star Wars kind of have a bad feeling about this.
That's right.
And that messages amongst the dispatch riders of what they'd seen in that rectangle there, that raw. To me, the Cobra is the first chance the Germans have seen in the American sector of the full-on raw power of what American might can bring to warfare. Because the hedgerows had almost camouflaged the size of the US forces. If you're a German defending somewhere near Saint-Lô, you're almost seeing equal numbers of people ahead of you as you've got with you. But what you're not seeing is that massive tail, the big war James Holland talks about behind it. And for me, Cobra is that announcement by the US to the Germans is we have shitloads of gear we're bringing your way now. We have shitloads. The artillery problem is getting to be resolved by now. I think you probably would agree. Still a few problems, but the air power thing. So now it's like, here's what we've got. Here's what we've got that we're unleashing on you now. So I would think on a morale, it's like we can. And we're going off on a rabbit hole, folks. You can have, for those of you who have got a drink in your hand, it's Woody's rabbit hole. We talk about the terror of the Yabos and the Germans have of the dive bombers and the Typhoons and things. And we know that the actual results of more German vehicles were destroyed by mortars and by artillery than were ever destroyed by Typhoons and Mustangs and P-47s coming in. But the Germans had the fear of the Typhoons. They didn't have of the artillery. And I think that's where the bombardment it puts the fear of God in the Germans that I think that the tanks coming out of the hedgerows didn't have quite the same effect. I'm interested to your reaction to my theory there.
Sure, and great. Thanks for bringing me back to the other side of this observation, because I do completely agree. The moral effect of the bombing was, I mean, you can't calculate how important it was, and I agree with all of the things you said. I think I'm partial to Weigley's argument only because I think that, for example, Bradley staked so much in this bombardment that he swung back and forth from when the fratricide events happened. This was a massive disaster, angry at everyone that was involved, despairing over the future of this operation, whether it could even be launched again. And then as soon as things started to look good, he would swing over to the bombardment is what made this happen. And I think what you would have seen, the moral effect certainly would not have been as great, if anywhere close to as great. But I think you would have seen similar gains, just at a much slower rate. I don't think the Germans, in the condition that they were in, could have stopped this operation from working, even if it had been much slower.
No, on that I completely agree. There's nothing. Whether or not they get hit by the heavy bombers is not affecting their ability to stop this advance. I think it's affecting their belief in whether they can stop the advance. That would be the point I think I would make.
Yeah, for sure, and I totally agree. That makes sense.
We're in danger, and I think people don't mind, of going down a massive road. We've got a request for doing a Simpsons show. We're getting a request for a Pete Casada show. People have been asking. We said we wouldn't go do this about McNair's involved in tank development. We can perhaps bring you back on the future and do that one its own separate thing. But we ought to just conclude the legacy of McNair and so we'll let you do your last couple of slides, and then folks, if you've got any kind of general questions, we'll deal with them. So back to you, and then we'll do questions.
Great. And I'll just say I'm at a big disadvantage here because Americans, we're in a different time zone. It's a little too early for me to have a drink, unlike all your viewers.
You want to cite mentally for later.
That's right. I think I've earned at least one. All right, great. So just a couple more things to talk about. I mean, this is just kind of a poignant slide. This is McNair, 1904. And then to the right, I mentioned Bonnie Claire McNair, the cute little girl there. That's Claire McNair, General McNair's wife, and his granddaughter, the Doug's daughter. You see, obviously, General Marshall there. And this is just a commemorative ceremony that was held at the War College. You can go see that plaque there. It's pretty a pretty nice plaque. And interestingly, Claire McNair had just returned from a European mission for the State Department, and I'm frustratingly ignorant on what that mission was because I haven't found any record of it.
Right.
But it's interesting. And so that's really pretty much it that I wanted to talk about. This is just one more. So this is 1911, the grand opening of the Field Artillery School in Oklahoma, and then the McNair Hall there now at Fort Sill headquarters. So just an interesting way to see how far the Army came in that fairly short period of McNair's career, and then moving forward to the modern day. So
well, thank you very well. I mean, I feel I could just talk to you all day, and we could just go down so many rabbit holes and go and find ourselves in interesting places, and that's a testament to how many pies he has his fingers in over his career. But that's a not a very good analogy there. But anyway, but legacies. I mean, you've micro studied McNair, and I'm sensing that it's not just because the book has been out. And again, I'll hold it up there, folks, and don't forget the link to purchase it is below, and you can find all your local bookshops and libraries and wherever you buy your books. But he comes up, of course, in everybody's general histories, and without naming and insulting certain historians, because that's not what we do, but what are the things that get said about McNair that you go, oh, that make that they're going to go, no, that's too simple or that's wrong? I mean, is there something that you think should be corrected about how the general military history world views McNair?
Yeah, actually, I do. And in fact, let me go to a backup slide real quick, if I can find it. I took it out. Yeah, so that's interesting. One of the things that I think is important to keep in mind is that McNair was responsible for preparing the Army to mobilize and deploy to combat in multiple theaters overseas, in not a hypothetical, the situation we would like it to be, but in the situation as it actually is. And at the start of the war, we had very little fleet to send units overseas. And the first section of the first part of Eisenhower's papers, the title of that section is "All We Need Is Ships." Shipping was one of the most important concerns that the Army had, both to get Lend-Lease going when that was happening, and then to keep Lend-Lease going while we also began to deploy troops to both, the Pacific and the Mediterranean, and ultimately the European theaters of war. So McNair's trying to design an army and equipment for the ground forces of that army that are efficient in their ability to be deployed. A 60-ton tank just wasn't a practical thing for the Army. One of McNair's things that he railed against and never really made had a lot of success with is transport of infantry in the infantry divisions. So many of the infantry divisions, their infantry transport was all tracks. It was, mechanized. And so this was, to McNair's view, the infantry are going to dismount before they fight. So why not just move them forward in trucks and then have them march the rest of the way to the battle? Trucks are kind of equally mobile, and they're much smaller, and they can be transported in higher numbers much more easily, require less fuel, easier to maintain, all these kinds of things. So McNair was really focused on efficiency and was very interested in the real conditions. Another one, he gets criticized a lot for being an advocate of towed anti-tank systems as opposed to mechanized anti-tank systems. And, by the end of the war, the tank destroyer had proven to be pretty useful. But earlier at the beginning of these debates, McNair was criticized because it just seemed unrealistic. But what people forget, as the historians go back and look at it now, is that, again, one of the main things that he was thinking about was, how do we get these things over there in numbers and maintain them and sustain them in combat? Lighter is more efficient. And he also had ideas about tactical reasons why the towed guns were better. Whether or not he was right, the logic for his arguments about these things tends to get lost in the translation. So do I think that we should have only developed towed anti-tank guns for World War II? Absolutely not. But when I read about the debate and McNair's role in it, do I wish there was a more detailed description of McNair's thinking and why he thought that way? Yeah, absolutely, I did.
Again, so it brings it back to data, because when you said that about the moving the infantry forward, it sounds, as someone who's on the ground, it sounds counterintuitive to use soft skin trucks when you've got half tracks. It sounds, of course, having some armor protection and better 4x4 abilities would be better. But again, from the data point of view, it makes complete sense to use a cheaper vehicle that are smaller, that can be transported quicker and replaced quicker and produced quicker to get that there. So that's so if you're going to mention the fact he's giving this argument as a historian, you need to say the reason for it. And Toad, I tell you, I could name numerous occasions in Normandy in the early stages where the advantage of a towed artillery piece in the anti-tank destroyer role was clear, and also later in the war, why the mobile mechanized Hellcat type tank destroyer becomes more, because it's the nature of the war has changed rapidly over those few months from June to May 1945, and what the Allies have against what the Germans have is changing day by day. But yet to throw out towed artillery because you have something better it's using things alongside, and that again is the kind of thing you can see him crunching the numbers and looking at it and looking up, well, this can do this type can do this. So it's interesting that's where he's thinking. It's always which way does the data take me?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and so these and I could mention more examples, but the general trend is this. And I like you mentioned earlier, it's the point isn't to berate historians that have come before me for not doing what I think they should have done and spend a bunch of time going down a rabbit hole to find these fine details of McNair's logic when the papers weren't easily accessible and nobody had even really tried to do a lot of that kind of work yet. These are acts of omission, not commission, right? But now that material is available, and I mean, if anything else is useful in the book, my bibliography should make it easier for future historians to take a little bit deeper look at him. So I think that's kind of the main thing that I would say is before people understand McNair, it just makes it really difficult to characterize him as qualified to hold the job he's in, or whether his arguments are logical or well-informed, because just based on what it is he's proposing, as opposed to the logic for why he's proposing it. Yeah. So I definitely like to see, a little bit wider awareness of what he was dealing with and the kinds of things that he was into, for sure.
Well, brilliant. I mean, essentially the comments in the sidebar are all now really about tanks, artillery, caliber sizes, things like that. All of which are fantastic, but they're too much to cover now in a few minutes as a wrap up of this. So I think we'll just leave an open invitation for you to come back at some point and develop these ideas and hone in either one aspect of McNair's thinking or several, or address or put it out to the viewers. What would you like you to discuss, and we'll do that. But it's been an absolute eye-opener. I love these ones where I go into it knowing a little and coming out knowing a lot, and also the kind of one that raises questions. I've got more things to go away and think about. It hasn't resolved everything. It's like just giving me more things to think about. I love discussing Cobra, and people say, well, there's Scott Grimwood. There's an outstanding presentation. Looking forward to Lieutenant Colonel Calhoun's next appearance on World War II TV. So it seemed like a perfect opportunity to ask you, what are you working on right now?
Right. So like many of the other historians I talk to regularly, COVID has really frustrated our efforts to do research with closed archives. I started studying General William H. Simpson. I guess it's been around four and a half years ago now. And like I said, the main reason I'm interested in him is that he's another person who just hasn't been covered a whole lot. It's amazing to me how many books I take off the shelf about the campaign in Northwest Europe or the European Theater of Operations, whatever, and he's not even in the index. I mean, Ninth Army might get mentioned. Usually it's just 21st Army Group, which Ninth Army happens to be part of during that period of the war, and Simpson doesn't come up at all. So that's why I'm interested in him. So there's an article that I had come out in the International Journal of Military History and Historiography last summer that is kind of a historiographical piece on the work that I've done on Simpson. And it talks about a fellow named Tom Stone, who was a lieutenant colonel, one of the early selectees into the PhD to West Point historian program that, this was in 1973. I don't know exactly when it was started, but he was in one of the early groups of people selected to do this. He went to Rice University and he wrote his master's and his doctorate about Simpson. And then he went back into his usual active duty series of assignments, and he could never finish the biography that he wanted to write. But I met him, and he still has a ton of material in his basement, and I got to travel up there to see him. In the midst of COVID, we stayed in different parts of the house, masked up, and he let us, myself and my wife, my best research assistant I've ever had, went down in his basement and went through all this other material that he has that he never managed to get donated to any archives. So it's a long project that I'm still kind of trying to get to where I have something I can write a book with. But right now I'm working on another paper that, I'll leave the exact subject really.
Yeah, don't say you don't want to, but yeah, I mean,
it had to do with the Rhine crossing. Yeah.
Oh, good. But if you're a Ninth Army guy, you've clearly been influenced by Kevin Hemel, because that's one of the things he talks about a lot as well. And yeah, there's. And this is that when we talk about it again, and we will bring things to an end. It's that the same subjects get talked about again and again, and yet there are massive, great subjects that are fundamental to our understanding of the ETO and beyond that just don't seem to get covered. And having just come back from the Balkans, I'm just waiting for someone to really launch in and do a modern, proper appraisal of Yugoslavia and the German offensives with a modern take of historiography, and because that needs doing, and yet there'll be probably 5 new Dam Busters books come out while we've been doing this show, and then 3 more on Pearl Harbor in the last 20 minutes. It's how many times can some of these stories be told? And yet there are actually these amazing ones out there that need to be telling. But anyway, I feel I've made a friend for life. I feel I've made another person I can just sit with in a pub and talk about stuff without ever really necessarily coming to conclusion. Cobra is I love studying Cobra because I always feel there's much more work to be done and fully understand it, the ground, the use of the Rhino abilities, and we're going to be covering 8 Wars Advance on Friday. So anyway, we'll bring things to an end. It's been great talking. Have you enjoyed talking to our erstwhile viewers today?
Yeah, this has been a blast. I'm really glad you invited me on, and I definitely look forward to doing it again.
Brilliant. So, folks, I will take him off screen and bring him back in a minute. But I'm just going to hold up one more time a copy of General Lesley McNair by our guest today. I'll remind you we have 2 shows coming your way tomorrow. Yes, I've just got back from traveling. I haven't had a night's sleep in about 3 days, but we have a show about the New Zealanders in Crete. That will be at 9 o'clock BST, so UK time in the morning, and then in the evening we're back at our normal time, continuing our week of studies of Cobra, and it's with Steve Ossad looking at Bradley's role in Cobra. So a little bit of overlap with today, but another historian, so slightly different opinions, slightly different versions of interpreting things, and eventually I'll dedicate even more to Cobra because, as I just admitted there, I love it. So again, if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe. The links you're needed there. It's definitely a reader, definitely a keeper, this one. It'll go on your general's biographies shelf alongside your ones of you watching now probably got already 5 or 6 books on pattern. Well, to balance all that, you need one on McNair. So I'll bring Mark back in one more time to say thank you very much. It's been an absolute blast. So
it's been a blast. Thanks so much.
Brilliant. So it's Paul Woodhouse, World War II TV, saying I'll see you all again next time. Cheers, everybody. Bye.